Gopal, Gopal, good morning. Great to see you. Until very recently, Executive Director of Tata, 16 years in the company, before that with Unilever, and part of his responsibilities at Unilever were here in the Kingdom. So very good to see you. I think it's quite remarkable. I mean, here am I talking to a former Tata executive. Tata executives don't like to talk to the press or to be talking publicly too often.
Well, first of all, I'm not yet. As of now, I'm not a Tata executive, so I suppose I can break the mold. But more importantly, I think Tata executives talk when they think they have something to say. And perhaps you have caught some Tata executives at a time they didn't want to say anything, so maybe it's just an aberration.
Tell us about the Tata culture, because it is very paternalistic in its own way and quite cautious, but very clear about the direction of travel. And I say that because you were a very senior executive for 16 years. And Tata is now making itself far more public internationally in many more ways than the public knew about Tata.
That's correct. Tata is 150 years old, so it changes all the time, otherwise it wouldn't survive. And Tata changes rather gradually. You've probably seen in the last 20 years a very dramatic change. And if I may forecast for the next 15 years, you're going to see a further dramatic change under a new leadership. Leadership changes usually provide the opportunity for a dramatic change. One happened when J.R.D. Tata stepped down after 50 years, and one has happened 3 years ago when Ratan Tata stepped down after 22 years.
There are many lessons from Tata, and that's why we're talking about your former position and your former responsibilities, because in many ways, Tata is seen as a fantastic symbol of what can be achieved, particularly because of the amount of your revenue you put into philanthropic operations. It's not a typical company. And you tend to have a reputation for being considered, quite slow in your decision making. We've just heard from John Rice there, the need to be agile and smart now in this new environment. How does a company like Tata shift the way it handles business decisions in this new, often overwhelming environment?
I think it's a challenge. To suggest that it isn't an issue would be rather silly. Tata is very reflective about what it does and takes its time making a decision. And some people criticize us for having taken what they perceive with hindsight as impetuous decisions, for example, in an acquisition. But to be honest, agility does not mean not using your ability to analyze and reflect. And Tata is constantly trying to balance the analytical and the rational with the intuitive. And occasionally, it could be argued it has got it not quite right.
Tata has got an extraordinary portfolio, which goes from Taj Hotels to oil to steel, big problems in Britain at the moment, but right around the world. And you went through the business of building cars, the Nano, which turned out to be a bit of a disaster, not least in where you decided to try to acquire a factory and just the problem of getting land there. And then, of course, there's been the amazing success of Jaguar Land Rover, but it's not Tata Jaguar Land Rover, it's Jaguar Land Rover, which is owned by Tata. What about the contrast there between great success and, frankly, things that have gone wrong?
You know, life is all about such contrasts. There are brilliant people who have a very difficult time in some other aspect of their lives. There is no doubt that our domestic passenger car business has had its enormous challenges. And I would slightly disagree with you that it is not Tata Jaguar Land Rover, but Jaguar Land Rover owned by Tata. Because
in the public space I'm talking about.
In the public space, I understand that.
There's no Tata symbol on a car.
That is correct, and that is deliberate. But what Tata does is to buy a company and allow the people in the company to express themselves more fully. And it took some Germans and some Brits to be put together to give expression to the dreams that they had. And I think Tata financed it and spoke up for it in terms of money. So I would like to believe that these are two sides of the same coin. How it will turn out, I cannot forecast.
What did you learn from the disaster of the Nano? The fact that you decided to go ahead with it, a $1,000 car, which was designed for the mass market, very slimmed down, the basics of a car, but actually you couldn't even build it.
I can tell you what I have learnt out of it, whether it's too early for me to say whether the corporation has learnt out of it. There was a nice TED video by Bill Gross where he said, why do startups fail? Nano is a startup within a large company. And I think Nano did not take off because it was an idea whose time hadn't come. It was too early, it was mistimed. There are many other things that went wrong with it, like the inadequacy of its positioning. But if I had to single out one reason, I think its time quite hadn't come.
But there was also the business of having to build a production plant, and you actually made misjudgments about acquisition of the land. The farmers got furious and gave you a very hard time.
On a point of fact, I would say we would not misjudge. We did not even take a single acre from a farmer. It was all bought by the government and given to us. And the politics of it was perhaps something which you could argue we misjudged, because an incumbent government was fighting a government which wanted to take over, a political party which wanted to take over. We just got ourselves into the fracas. To be honest, we did not buy the land, but the government which bought the land.
But one of the critical things that you've done in Tata, and you had this job before it became a more public job, was custodian of the brand, which is a fascinating. I remember being given the card by Mukund Rajan, the brother of the governor of the Reserve Bank, and I said, "What's this, Mukund?" And he said, "That's what we're in the business of doing now, looking after the brand." What has changed inside Tata family and the corporation to understand that the brand needs to be cherished?
I think it was an insight that came with the leadership change in 1991 when Ratan Tata took over from J.R.D. Tata, where he felt that there was some value in the Tata brand. And we began a journey which I have walked with him and under his guidance to value the Tata brand and to see what it takes to enhance it. And today the market capitalization of Tata, the whole group of companies, is estimated to be about $130 billion. And I'm very pleased to say that the valuations of the brand come to over 25. Now that is something we had not got a handle on. And I therefore say to all my 500,000 colleagues who work in Tata, that the most valuable thing you're allowed to touch, like the Kohinoor in the Queen of England's armory, set of jewels, is the Tata brand. And that gives you that sense of awe that the brand is the biggest intellectual property a business can build. And it has made people very, very conscious of the power of the brand. In a country where the brand has existed for 150 years but was never given that kind of focus. So the word custodian is not inappropriate. We're really treating it like the real jewel of the business.
If there's a brand to look after, why isn't it Tata Hotels or Tata Cars like Jaguar Land Rover, or, I mean, obviously Tata Steel, which is a significant negative for you for Tata at the moment. But what would you say to those who are wrestling with reputation brand, both regionally, nationally and internationally, about the importance of having one name which is linked to every product in a massive portfolio, so people know it's the Tata brand or whatever brand it is?
Well, there are certainly risks, but I have to say this has evolved. It is not that we had some documented policy which we systematically and consistently implemented over 150 years. The founder initially said he would not attach his name to any company. That's why Taj is not called Tata Hotel. It's called the Indian Hotel Company. He was a nationalist. And because he died, his son thought it appropriate to call the company Tata Steel and Iron Works. Had the founder lived, it would not have been called the Tata Steel and Iron Works. So there was a period of self-effacement when the founder did not attribute his name to the company. And then the sons and the successors started to do so. And then early in the 1990s, we felt that we might have stretched the brand too much. So we now have the Tata brand, or we also have brands by Tata, and we also have some which just say Tata Enterprise.
Does that lead to clarity, do you think?
I don't think it's as clear as I would like it to be, but sometimes in resolving the inheritances of history, you live with a little bit of ambiguity.
How does your executive director, how does the argument go within the board?
Well, frankly, the argument is, do you own up that it is Tata? And we say that whether it's Jaguar Land Rover or Chorus in the UK, it is Tata. Because when the minister wants to
You know, but does the public know?
Oh yes, absolutely. I don't think the British press is letting Tata off the hook very easily, either for the credit for the Jaguar Land Rover or for the discredit for something else.
When you think of difficult decisions that have had to be made, and I come from Britain, and within the last 2 weeks, Tata has announced the scaling down significantly of Britain's largest steelworks in Port Talbot in South Wales. But I do that not because I'm a Brit, but because it's emblematic of a significant problem in the steel industry, particularly from Chinese oversupply. When you think back to the board decisions you were involved in 10 years ago, when Tata was wanting to invest in steel, what was the prognosis then about why Tata should be involved and saw it as a profit center?
You know, to be honest, the set of assumptions that we had at that time in the world, we didn't know that something called Lehman Brothers is going to happen. I don't think anybody knew, including Lehman Brothers. Iron ore was selling at over $100. Steel was selling at astronomical prices. Chinese, it was thought, would consume steel till we are all very, very old people. Lehman Brothers happened, and a number of things happened subsequent to that, which changed the whole dynamic. And of course, things are happening in China right now. So it is with hindsight one can say that despite the quality, high quality of debate you guys had, you could not foretell the future, and that is a charge I would accept. It's not easy.
We just heard from John from GE, when something's going badly, you shut it down. You just have to make a very difficult decision. Is that the kind of thing that Tata finds quite difficult?
We do find it difficult. We are not accustomed to closing down companies and businesses. But we do it with a humane spirit. And therefore, we always tell our people, we don't assure you that you'll be there forever. But if you have to part, we'll do it in a humane way. It is not much written in the chronicles that Tata Steel in India reduced 50,000 people out of 80,000 people without a squeak. It's the world's greatest case history in downsizing. But we spent the money to make sure they were not out on the streets. And I'm sure that whatever we finally come to in the UK, we will do our darndest best to achieve in the same way.
In our final 2 or 3 minutes, Gopal, the business of philanthropy, for which Tata is renowned, particularly in India, how important is that to the brand? Others would expect surplus cash to go to shareholders. You have a very clear message and mission, which is to do something rather different with your money. What's your reflection on that principle?
You know, Tata was born, like in Britain, in the industries of the 1880s, 1890s, with we are the world's first socialistic capitalists, or capitalistic socialists. The founder said that the firm is not standing apart from the community, we are there because of the community, and so what we earn from the people of this country must go back to the people of this country. He used the word country, today you could say consumers all around the world. And that was the motto of Unilever, Lever Brothers. And when the founder of Unilever died, he left a lot of money with the Leverhulme Trust, and so did he. So it's a fundamental belief. And we don't see a tension between capitalism and socialism. We find there's a tension in the minds of capitalism elsewhere, if I may say so in a broad way, in the Anglo-Saxon world, but that's the tension they have to sort out.
But given that we are in an age of corporate social responsibility, CSR, you worked for Unilever before, you've now been working for Tata. What's your message about how companies, many more corporations, could take that view without diluting their direction of travel, ultimately as successful corporations?
You know, I can talk only from my experience in two wonderful companies, Unilever and Tata. And I can say this, if I take an example from nature, no species has survived if it has not found an equilibrium with other species in its ecosystem. And the same is true of corporations. Long-living corporations, anywhere in the world, and I've done some study on this, find an equilibrium within their ecosystem where, whether you call it CSR, you call it socialistic capitalism, they have found a way to balance the multiple interests of stakeholders. And just like species in nature survive, these companies also survive.
Last thought, Gopal, you've retired at the age of 70. It's very tough these days as an executive director or a director of any company. Public expectation, The world is moving amazingly fast, often in unthinkable directions. What's your reflection of the challenges now in the boardroom?
I think the real challenge of the boardroom is accepting diversity as a fundamental part of governance and accepting that if there is a difference between the multiple stakeholders, it is your job to resolve it.
What do you mean by diversity? What's your definition of diversity?
I think society is complex in every part of the world with aspirations, whether it's gender diversity, caste, nationalities. We now have 500,000 people, of whom 100,000 people are foreigners, so we can't continue to think of ourselves as an Indian company anymore. And therefore, the ability to express empathy with another point of view which comes from a different philosophy is extremely important.
What about the new realities of geopolitics, not just within a nation like India, but around the world? It's a very complex world, many uncertainties happening very quickly, through which you've got to make sound, or the soundest possible, business judgments, accepting that anything can go wrong. What's your reflection of the interface now between corporate decision making and the geopolitics in this very uncertain world?
I think it comes down to saying, what are the political risks I'm willing to subject my business to? A very classic case is Iran. I mean, on the one hand, Iran is opening up. On the other hand, companies are very carefully crafting the steps as to how and if and when they would enter Iran. And that's a product of the modern geopolitics in the world. Iran is a very, very good classic example.
But what I'm getting at is geopolitics now becoming a more significant factor in the kind of judgments that you were having to be involved in the corporation you've just left?
I think so. But I suspect if you ask my predecessor 40 years ago, he would have said the same thing. Because it is an era when colonialism has just ended, new democracies and new countries were emerging, and they had to be sensitive to those geopolitics.
But he didn't have a smartphone. He had probably a telex machine.
Correct. That is true. I agree that the forces of technology are rapidly changing, but the tools to cope with those changes are also rapidly changing. And you alluded to the cell phone. So I think the gap between the two is pretty constant.
Final thought, what about the next generation? What are you seeing, not just in India but elsewhere? There are some who say that actually many of the new generation who might have seen themselves as the future mid-career fast trackers going into major corporations are now wanting to start up their own companies. They want to take their own risks. They don't want to actually become corporates. Is that what you're discovering?
I think so. There's an energy everywhere around. You see, this point about startups should not be dismissed cynically by people of my sort of age group. Unilever is also a startup. Just happened to be 150 years ago. So was Tata, and so was every other firm. But there's an energy with young people. India is absolutely throbbing with that energy, and I'm sure it's happening in many other parts of the country. And I think this is a new wave of entrepreneurship driven by the new technologies that's going to dramatically change the world. And young people are fantastic, honestly fantastic, because they're willing to take the risks and they have a support system which allows them to take that risk. I'm very, very optimistic that our children and grandchildren are going to live much better than us.
But were you finding that the next generation, the XYZ, the millennials, were less interested in coming into Tata?
There are some sections which are less interested in coming into well-established companies, no doubt about it. People aren't queuing up in B schools in the United States to join General Motors, for example, and that's true of Tata in India. But there are sufficient number of young people, so far as India is concerned, who still want a career in a large company.
Is that going to be a challenge, do you think, to the major corporates?
Absolutely. Talent will be a challenge, and to pretend that it doesn't exist doesn't help. I'd just like to make a mention talking about talent. When I came here as the chairman of Unilever Arabia, living in Jeddah in 1991, one of my challenges was, how do you get Saudis to run this company? You're all expatriates. And Floris Malias, who was the chairman of Unilever NV, set me the challenge. And we went to every business school campus in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. I remember going to King Fahad University. I remember going to Bahrain, to Kuwait. And we recruited 11 young people. And I sent them for training to Al Jizan. It's not a place young people wanted to go to in those days. But I'm very proud to say, not because of myself, but because of the Unilever system, One of them is the chairman of Unilever Saudi Arabia today. And I'd love to see Saudi Arabia develop its capabilities in human capital, and I think it's possible.
Gopal, thank you very much indeed. I should tell you he hasn't retired. He's given me his new card, which says MindWorks. So you've just refocused your life, moving on from where you've been executive director at Tata. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.